Behind you, 6 men wait for orders, their faces reflecting a mixture of trust and terror that you've grown to recognize over the months of leading this unit. They believe you know what you're doing, that your calm exterior reflects inner confidence and superior knowledge about how to navigate situations like this. The truth is more complicated. You're as frightened as they are, making decisions based on incomplete information and desperate improvisation rather than tactical expertise, but leadership in combat requires projecting certainty even when you feel none, because panic is contagious and spreads faster through small units than any disease. Your men need to believe that someone understands what's happening, that their lives are in capable hands, that the risks they're taking serve purposes larger than random violence. This is where most resistance operations end, not in glorious battle, but in abasement, facing an impossible choice. The tactical situation is deteriorating by the minute. Attack now, and you'll be fighting German soldiers who hold the high ground in a building they know better than you do, with superior equipment and prepared defensive positions. Wait too long, and your diversionary forces, Stefan's group and Marek's group, will be overwhelmed by German reinforcements, leaving 15 men to die because their commander hesitated when decisive action might have created opportunities for success. But there's a third variable you haven't fully considered: the timing of your diversionary attacks. Stefan and Marek are supposed to begin their operations in approximately 10 minutes, which will draw German attention away from this building regardless of whether you're ready to exploit the distraction. If you wait for perfect conditions that may never arrive, you waste the sacrifices your men are making elsewhere in the city. The lock finally gives way with a soft click that seems impossibly loud in the confined space. You ease the grate open just wide enough to slip through, testing the hinges for squeaks or resistance that might announce your presence to whoever is smoking above. The metal moves smoothly, another indication of recent maintenance that could mean either German preparation or Polish resistance staging. You're now in the basement of a German ammunition depot, armed with a British Sten gun that holds 32 rounds and a plan that depends entirely on variables you can't control. The basement smells different from the tunnel, less stagnant, more chemical, the particular mixture of gun oil, explosives, and industrial solvents that indicates active weapons storage rather than abandoned supplies. #why you wouldn't last a day as Wanda Gertz in the Warsaw Uprising. Boring history. August 1st, 1944, 5 p.m. The church bells ring across Warsaw, but they're not calling people to prayer. They're signaling the beginning of the largest underground resistance operation in Nazi-occupied Europe. In 63 days, over 200,000 civilians will die. Entire districts will be reduced to rubble, and the course of World War II will shift forever. But right now, in this moment, you're about to discover why being Wanda Gertz, the woman commanding a battalion of Polish fighters, was perhaps the most impossible job in human history. Your real name is Kazimierza Gertz, but that identity died months ago when you joined the Polish Home Army. The transformation wasn't just about changing names, it required rewriting everything about yourself. The way you walked, talked, held your shoulders, even the way you breathed had to change. Female officers were technically allowed in the resistance, but commanding men required a different kind of authority, one that came more naturally when they believed you were one of them. Now you're Wanda, and the 23 men crammed into this basement cellar are waiting for your orders. They don't know you're a woman. Your close-cropped hair, military jacket, and deliberately deepened voice have fooled them for weeks. The constant performance is exhausting, monitoring every gesture, every inflection, every moment of casual interaction that might betray your biological sex. You've learned to bind your chest so tightly that breathing becomes difficult during physical exertion. You've perfected the art of urinating standing up using techniques learned from other women in similar situations. You've studied how men move their hands when they talk, how they distribute their weight when standing, how they respond to jokes about women and sex. But as the uprising begins and the stakes become life or death, keeping that secret will be the least of your problems. The deeper challenge isn't maintaining your masculine disguise, it's reconciling the person you were raised to be with the person this war demands you become. You press your ear to the cellar wall. Through 2 feet of brick and mortar, you can hear the distinctive crack of Mauser rifles mixing with the rapid chatter of Polish Sten guns. The sound every resistance fighter has been waiting for: open warfare in the streets of Warsaw. After 5 years of Nazi occupation, the Polish Home Army is finally making its move to liberate the city before the Soviets arrive. Intelligence reports suggest the Germans have only 16,000 troops in Warsaw. The home army has 40,000. The math should be simple, but you know better than to trust mathematics in war. Numbers on paper don't account for training, equipment, morale, or the thousand unpredictable variables that turn military theory into bloody chaos. The Germans who remain in Warsaw aren't occupation bureaucrats. They're hardened SS units with combat experience from the Eastern Front. They've spent 5 years learning the city's geography, establishing defensive positions, and preparing for exactly this scenario. More troubling is what the intelligence reports don't mention: the quality of Polish equipment. Your men carry a mixture of British airdrops, captured German weapons, and homemade firearms that are as likely to jam as fire. Ammunition is rationed so strictly that target practice has been limited to dry runs with unloaded weapons. Many of your fighters have never fired their rifles under combat conditions. The basement cellar where you're gathered smells like damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the particular metallic scent that comes from cleaning weapons with improvised oils. 23 faces stare at you in the dim candlelight, young faces mostly, but carrying the particular weight that comes from watching your country dismantled piece by piece over 5 years of occupation. Stefan, your lieutenant, looks barely old enough to shave, but his hands are steady as he checks his weapon for the 5th time in 10 minutes. Tomasz, the former university student, has developed a nervous habit of reciting poetry under his breath, not because he's afraid, but because poetry is the only thing that still connects him to the person he was before the war. Commander, whispers Stefan, your lieutenant. He's 19, barely old enough to shave, but his eyes hold the hardened look of someone who's seen too much death too young. His family owned a small bakery in the Praga district until German regulations made it impossible to obtain flour legally. Now he spends his days planning ambushes instead of kneading dough. The radio's crackling. They're saying German reinforcements are moving in from the west. That changes everything, and everyone in the cellar understands the implications immediately. The plan relied on speed, strike fast, control key positions, hold until Soviet forces crossed the Vistula River. German reinforcements weren't in the original calculations, but then again, neither were a dozen other variables that have already started complicating what was supposed to be a straightforward liberation operation. Through the small basement window, you can see civilians hurrying past with suitcases and bundles, some moving toward what they hope are safer districts, others simply fleeing without clear destinations. A woman passes carrying a child who can't be more than 3 years old. The child is clutching a stuffed rabbit that's missing one ear. For some reason, that detail, the missing ear on a child's toy, crystallizes everything that's wrong with the situation you're about to enter. This isn't a military operation happening in isolation. It's urban warfare in a city of over 1 million people, most of whom have nowhere to go and no way to distinguish between liberation and destruction. You study the hand-drawn map spread across the cellar's wooden table, its edges curled from humidity and marked with pencil annotations that have been erased and rewritten dozens of times as intelligence changed. Red X marks show your targets: the telephone exchange on Zielna Street, the railway station, 3 ammunition depots. Your battalion's job is to secure a 6-block radius in the city center, territory that includes over 3,000 civilians who will either live or die based on the decisions you make in the next few hours. But the map doesn't show everything that matters. It doesn't indicate which buildings have been secretly reinforced by German engineers, which streets have been mined, which civilians might be collaborators willing to report resistance positions for money or food. It doesn't show the psychological landscape: which of your men will freeze under fire, which will break under pressure, which will make the kind of split-second decisions that save or doom everyone around them. Most importantly, the map doesn't show the weight of command itself. Every mark on that paper represents choices you'll have to make without complete information, under extreme stress, with consequences that will haunt you whether you live through the next week or not. The red X over the ammunition depot isn't just a tactical objective. It's a decision to risk 12 men's lives for supplies that might already be evacuated or booby-trapped. But here's what no one tells you about commanding during an urban uprising: every choice is a death sentence for someone. Stefan hands you a slip of paper: casualty reports from the first hour of fighting. The handwriting is rushed, barely legible, written by someone whose hands were probably shaking. 12 dead, 19 wounded, 3 missing. These aren't numbers on a strategic assessment. These are men you've shared cigarettes with, whose wives you've met, whose children ask about Uncle Stefan or Uncle Marek when they visit the safe houses. Tomasz Kowalski, age 21, shot by a sniper while crossing Marszałkowska Street. Henryk Nowak, 34, 2 daughters, killed by grenade fragments during the assault on the post office. The missing include Zbigniew, who could play guitar well enough to make people forget they were hungry, last seen entering a building that was subsequently destroyed by German artillery. Behind each name is a story that will now never be completed. Tomasz was studying engineering before the war and spoke passionately about rebuilding Poland's infrastructure after liberation. Henry carried photographs of his daughters and showed them to anyone willing to listen. Zbigniew joined the resistance after watching German soldiers burn his family's bookstore. These men believed in something larger than their individual survival, but their deaths feel intensely personal rather than historically significant. The gap between individual tragedy and strategic necessity is one of the things military training never adequately prepares you for. You fold the paper and slide it into your jacket pocket, next to the small metal object that represents your ultimate contingency plan. The men are watching your face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. They need to see confidence, even if you're calculating how many more of them will be dead by sunset. Leadership in combat requires a kind of performance that's simultaneously authentic and artificial. You must genuinely care about these men's lives while projecting the kind of certainty that helps them function under impossible circumstances, but there's something else weighing on your mind, something that distinguishes your situation from that of male commanders. The morphine hidden in your boot is a single syringe of morphine, saved from a medical supply drop 3 months ago. For male resistance fighters, capture means interrogation, torture, and eventual execution. For women resistance fighters, especially those in command positions, capture means something worse, a process of degradation designed not just to extract information, but to break the prisoner's sense of human dignity before death. You've heard the reports from other occupied territories, whispered accounts from the few women who escaped German detention. The morphine represents a choice you pray you'll never have to make, but its presence in your boot shapes every tactical decision. You can't allow yourself to be captured alive, which means you can't take the kind of calculated risks that might be acceptable for male commanders. The weight of that small medical device affects how you think about retreat routes, backup plans, and acceptable casualty rates. Every operation must include provisions for your own death, not just as a military loss, but as a way of protecting the integrity of whatever remains of your humanity. Listen carefully, you say, your voice carrying the authority that's kept them alive this long. The Germans will try to split us into small groups, then eliminate us building by building. We stay together. We move fast. We don't hold positions we can't defend. The words come out with more confidence than you feel, but that's part of command, projecting certainty when certainty is impossible. Your men need to believe that someone understands what's happening, even when the person giving orders is improvising based on incomplete information and desperate hope. What happens next will test every assumption you have about courage, leadership, and survival. Your battalion moves through Warsaw's sewers, navigating by memory through tunnels that smell like decay and human waste mixed with something else, the particular stench of fear that seems to permeate enclosed spaces during wartime. The city above is erupting in gunfire, but down here the only sounds are dripping water, the shuffle of boots on wet concrete, and the occasional whispered curse when someone slips on the treacherous surface. The sewers weren't built for military operations, and every aspect of movement down here feels like an affront to human dignity. They're narrow, slippery, and filled with pockets of methane gas that could ignite from a single spark. The air is thick enough to chew, a mixture of sewage, industrial runoff, and the accumulated rot of 5 years of wartime neglect. You have to breathe through your mouth to avoid gagging, but that means tasting everything you're trying not to smell. Every few minutes, someone slips and crashes into the wall, the sound echoing through the tunnels like a gunshot. Each noise could betray your position to German patrols above, who have learned to monitor sewer access points since resistance fighters began using underground routes. The psychological pressure of maintaining silence while navigating treacherous terrain tests everyone's self-control. Tomasz, usually the most composed member of your unit, has started muttering prayers under his breath. Stefan's hands shake so badly he can barely grip his rifle properly, but you have advantages the enemy doesn't expect. You know these tunnels not just from maps, but from months of careful exploration. The Polish Home Army has been mapping every passage, every junction, every exit since 1942. You've memorized the route to your target, studied alternative paths in case the primary route becomes blocked or compromised, and established emergency protocols for different scenarios. More importantly, you understand something about tunnel warfare that German commanders don't. The psychological advantage belongs to whoever knows the underground geography better. Down here, superior equipment and training matter less than familiarity with terrain. The Germans might have better weapons and more ammunition, but they're fighting in an environment that favors local knowledge over military technology. Your target is a German ammunition depot that, according to intelligence gathered 3 days ago, contains enough supplies to keep your forces fighting for weeks. Artillery shells, rifle ammunition, hand grenades, and possibly explosives that could be used for sabotage operations against German infrastructure. But intelligence in wartime has a shelf life measured in hours, and 3 days might as well be 3 months in terms of accuracy. That's the theory, anyway. The reality is that your intel comes from a single source, a Polish worker who was forced into labor at the depot and managed to pass information through a network of sympathizers before disappearing. He could have been discovered and executed, in which case German forces might be using the depot as bait for exactly the kind of operation you're attempting. He could have been tortured and forced to provide false information. Or he could have simply been wrong about what he saw during his brief time inside the facility. The reality is that you won't know what you're facing until you emerge from the sewers directly into what could be a killing ground. The ammunition depot might already be evacuated, heavily reinforced, or booby-trapped. German forces have had 5 years to prepare defensive positions throughout Warsaw, and they've learned from resistance operations in other occupied territories, but the potential reward justifies the risk, at least in strategic terms. Without ammunition, the Warsaw Uprising becomes a futile gesture that will consume Polish lives without achieving meaningful military objectives. With sufficient supplies, resistance fighters might hold out long enough for international political pressure to force German concessions, or for Soviet forces to provide genuine support rather than waiting for Polish forces to exhaust themselves. Stefan taps your shoulder and points ahead. Light is filtering down through a manhole cover, your exit point, the culmination of 40 minutes spent crawling through the intestines of a city under siege. But something's wrong. The light isn't moving the way sunlight should. It's steady, artificial, the kind of illumination that comes from German floodlights positioned to eliminate shadows where resistance fighters might hide. You hold up a closed fist, and 23 men freeze instantly, their training overriding the claustrophobic panic that comes from being trapped in confined spaces during combat operations. The silence that follows is complete except for the distant drip of water and the collective sound of men trying to breathe quietly while their hearts pound with adrenaline. In the silence, you can hear voices above, German voices, close enough that you catch fragments of conversation. They're discussing patrol routes, shift changes, something about additional security around strategic targets. The words drift down through the manhole cover with casual efficiency that suggests these soldiers aren't expecting immediate combat. They're conducting routine security operations, which means they don't know about your approach route, but they're also discussing the specific building you're planning to target, which means German command has identified the ammunition depot as a likely objective for resistance operations. They know about the depot, and they're waiting. Not necessarily for you specifically, but for exactly the kind of infiltration you're attempting. The conversation above continues, and you begin to understand the broader tactical situation from German perspective. Additional units have been positioned around critical infrastructure throughout the city. Patrol schedules have been modified to provide overlapping coverage of potential approach routes. Command has issued specific orders about prisoners. Resistance fighters are to be captured alive when possible for interrogation about network structures and future operations. That last piece of information changes your risk calculations entirely. Capture isn't just a personal nightmare, It's a threat to every safe house, every resistance cell, and every civilian who has provided support to Polish forces. Under interrogation, even the strongest people eventually break, and you know the locations of dozens of other resistance operations. The weight of that knowledge affects how you think about acceptable losses and tactical retreats. You can't allow yourself to be captured, but you also can't abandon the mission without attempting to achieve objectives that could determine whether other resistance operations succeed or fail. This is the moment where your inexperience could kill everyone under your command. Command decisions in combat situations require a kind of mental calculus that can't be learned from textbooks or training exercises. You've read about tactics in resistance manuals smuggled from London, studied German military procedures captured from dead officers, and memorized maps of Warsaw's underground infrastructure. But reading about urban warfare and commanding it are different things entirely, like the difference between studying swimming techniques and jumping into deep water while people shoot at you. Every decision you make now will ripple through the next 12 hours, determining who lives, who dies, and whether the Warsaw Uprising succeeds or becomes a massacre that provides German forces with propaganda about Polish terrorist activities. The men crouched behind you in this sewer tunnel are trusting you to make choices based on experience you don't have, using judgment developed through situations you've never faced, but inexperience also means you haven't learned what's impossible, which sometimes becomes an advantage when conventional wisdom would counsel retreat. Military doctrine teaches caution, careful planning, overwhelming force applied to achieve limited objectives. Resistance warfare teaches improvisation, acceptable losses, and the willingness to attempt operations that regular military units would consider suicidal, standing in sewage beneath Nazi-occupied Warsaw, listening to German patrol schedules. You have three options, each representing different assumptions about acceptable risk and probable outcomes. Option 1. Abort the mission and return through the sewers. It's the safe choice, the one that keeps your men alive and preserves your unit's capability for future operations. You retreat, find another target, approach different objectives with better intelligence and more favorable circumstances. It's tactically sound, strategically sensible, and psychologically devastating. Your men volunteered for an operation they believed would make a difference in the liberation of their city. Returning empty-handed means explaining that their courage and commitment weren't sufficient to overcome German security measures. More importantly, it abandons the ammunition supplies that other resistance units are counting on for their own operations. Safety, but at the cost of strategic momentum and morale. Option 2. Proceed with the original plan despite changed circumstances. Surface near the depot, rely on speed and surprise to overcome whatever German reinforcements have been positioned around the target. It's the kind of military decision that honors original objectives and demonstrates commitment to mission completion. Your men expect this choice, it's why they followed you through the sewers instead of finding safer ways to spend their final days of life. But it's also potentially suicidal given what you've learned about German preparations. Superior German positioning, better equipment, and advance warning about likely resistance objectives make success improbable and casualties inevitable. Option 3. The option that occurs to you in this moment, crouched in sewage beneath Nazi-occupied Warsaw, breathing air thick with methane and decay while listening to enemy soldiers discuss how to kill you. An option so dangerous that military textbooks would call it insane, but which might succeed precisely because no reasonable commander would attempt it. You're going to split your force, create multiple diversions, and attack the depot from 3 directions simultaneously. It's a plan that requires perfect timing, absolute trust, and the kind of luck that doesn't exist in war zones. More importantly, it requires dividing your already small force into even smaller units that will be more vulnerable individually but might succeed collectively if everything goes exactly right. The mathematics of the plan are simultaneously elegant and terrifying. Instead of presenting German defenders with a single target they can concentrate fire against, you'll force them to divide their attention among multiple simultaneous threats. German training emphasizes disciplined response to coordinated attacks, but their doctrine assumes they'll be fighting conventional military units with predictable tactical approaches, not resistance fighters willing to attempt operations that violate every principle of sound military planning. But the plan also means accepting that some of your men will die to create opportunities for others. The diversionary attacks won't just be noise and distraction, There'll be genuine combat operations where people shoot at each other with intent to kill. Men who volunteered to risk their lives capturing ammunition will instead sacrifice their lives creating tactical advantages they won't live to exploit. You divide your men into 3 groups, trying to balance combat capability with the personal relationships that help small units maintain cohesion under extreme stress. Stefan takes 8 men and will surface 2 blocks north, creating noise and drawing German attention away from your actual objective. His group includes Tomasz, who studied engineering and understands urban infrastructure well enough to identify targets that will create maximum confusion with minimum resources. They also have Marek, whose experience as a mechanic allows him to improvise explosive devices from captured German equipment. Marek, your demolitions expert, takes 7 men south to cut telephone lines and disable German communications. Communication disruption won't eliminate German ability to coordinate defensive responses, but it will slow their reaction time and force them to rely on runners rather than telephone networks. Marek's group includes the former postal workers who understand Warsaw's communication infrastructure better than most military personnel. You'll lead the remaining 7 directly to the depot through a route that exists only in your memory, a forgotten maintenance tunnel that should emerge inside the target building. Should. That word contains all the uncertainty that makes this plan either brilliant or suicidal. The maintenance tunnel was identified from pre-war city planning documents that may be outdated, incomplete, or simply wrong. Even if the tunnel exists and remains accessible, you won't know whether it leads to a strategic advantage or a death trap until you're already committed to the approach. But as you're about to discover, should is the most dangerous word in warfare. The maintenance tunnel is smaller than you expected, much smaller, barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through on their belly. The pre-war engineering documents that identified this route were created for civilian maintenance operations, not military infiltration. The tunnel was designed for accessing underground utility lines, which means it's dimensioned for workers carrying tools, not fighters carrying weapons and ammunition. You have to crawl on your belly, pushing your rifle ahead of you, breathing air thick with dust and chemical fumes that make your eyes water and throat burn. The confined space triggers a claustrophobic panic that you have to suppress through conscious effort. Panic in a tunnel this narrow could mean death for everyone behind you. There's no room to turn around, no space to retreat if the route becomes blocked. Forward movement is the only option. The men behind you are struggling even more than you anticipated. These aren't trained tunnel rats or mine workers, they're shopkeepers and students turned fighters who joined the resistance to defend their city, not to crawl through underground passages that feel like premature burial. Stefan's breathing becomes labored within minutes of entering the tunnel. Behind him, someone else starts making the kind of low whimpering sounds that indicate approaching psychological breakdown. Behind you, Tomasz's breathing becomes labored, panicked, the rapid, shallow inhalations that signal claustrophobia setting in. In confined spaces, panic spreads faster than fire, and panicked men make fatal mistakes. They thrash against walls, scream for escape, abandon mission discipline for the immediate need to get out of situations their minds interpret as death traps. You stop crawling and twist around to face the group, an awkward maneuver in a space barely wide enough for your shoulders. The movement sends shooting pains through your back and ribs, reminders of the physical cost of operations that push human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Look at me, you whisper to Tomasz, whose eyes reflect the particular terror that comes from feeling buried alive. Just look at my eyes. Nothing else exists right now except my voice and your breathing. We're going to count together. In through your nose, out through your mouth. For 3 minutes, you conduct an impromptu therapy session in a tunnel that could become your grave, using techniques you learned not from military training but from helping your younger sister through childhood nightmares years before the war. It's not in any military manual, but it's the difference between completing your mission and watching your men break down before they ever see combat. The psychological management of small unit operations requires skills that aren't taught in tactical courses, understanding how fear manifests differently in different people, recognizing the signs of impending breakdown, and knowing when to push people beyond their comfort zones versus when to provide reassurance and support. The tunnel ends at a metal grate that opens into the basement of a building that should be abandoned according to your intelligence. Should be. Through the grate slats, you can see concrete walls, wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling, and something that makes your heart skip: German writing on the crates. Gothic lettering spelling out words you recognize from months of studying captured German documents: munition, artillery, Sprengstoff. You found the ammunition depot, exactly where intelligence reports placed it. But the presence of supplies doesn't guarantee the absence of guards, and the freshness of the German writing suggests recent inventory activity rather than abandoned storage. But you can also see something else that complicates your tactical assessment: boot prints in the dust covering the basement floor. Fresh ones, with distinctive tread patterns that match German military footwear. The building isn't empty, and whoever is inside has been moving around recently enough that their footprints haven't been disturbed by settling dust. You listen for 2 full minutes, trying to separate building sounds from human sounds, normal structural settling from purposeful movement. Creaking wood, settling concrete, whine through broken windows, all the random noise that comes from damaged buildings in war zones. And then, drifting down from above, the unmistakable smell of cigarette smoke. Someone is smoking directly above your position, close enough that the scent reaches you through floorboards and ventilation gaps. Cigarette smoke means either a guard making rounds or a civilian taking shelter in what they believe is a secure location. But German military discipline prohibits smoking on duty except in designated areas, which suggests either relaxed security procedures or civilian presence. Neither option fits perfectly with what you expected to find. You signal for silence and begin working on the grate's lock with tools that feel inadequate for the job: a bent wire and a small knife blade that you've adapted for lock-picking through trial and error rather than formal training. Every scrape of metal on metal sounds like a gunshot in the confined space, echoing through the tunnel in ways that seem guaranteed to alert anyone listening above. The lock mechanism is old but well-maintained, suggesting recent attention from someone who understood the importance of keeping access routes functional. German efficiency or Polish resistance preparation, you can't tell which, and the difference could determine whether you emerge into a tactical advantage or an ambush. The lock gives way, and you ease the grate open just wide enough to slip through. You're now in the basement of a German ammunition depot, armed with a British Sten gun that holds 32 rounds and a plan that depends entirely on luck. Above you, floorboards creak as someone walks across the room with the casual pace of routine movement rather than alert patrolling. One person, based on the footsteps, possibly a guard making regular rounds or someone comfortable enough in this space to move without concern about making noise. But guards don't usually smoke on duty unless they're bored, comfortable, or convinced that nothing threatening is going to happen during their shift. You climb through the opening and help pull your men up after you, one by one, each emergence from the tunnel requiring careful coordination to minimize noise while maintaining tactical readiness. 7 fighters now stand in enemy territory, surrounded by enough explosives to level a city block if detonated improperly. The irony isn't lost on you. You're simultaneously in the safest place in Warsaw, surrounded by supplies your forces desperately need, and the most dangerous place in the city, where a single spark could vaporize everyone within 100 meters. Wooden crates are stacked floor to ceiling throughout the basement, each one marked with German military designations that you recognize from intelligence briefings. Artillery shells of various calibers, rifle ammunition in quantities sufficient to supply. Battalion-level operations, hand grenades, demolition charges, and specialized equipment for engineering operations. If you can capture even a portion of these supplies, your forces will have enough materials to sustain combat operations for months instead of weeks. But possession requires control, and control requires neutralizing whoever is upstairs before they can alert German command about resistance infiltration. The supplies are valuable only if you can transport them to Polish positions without being intercepted by German patrols, and transportation requires time and security that you may not have. You assign positions based on the tactical principles you've learned through months of small unit operations. 3 men watch the stairway to prevent surprise from above. 2 cover the basement windows to detect approaching German reinforcements, and 2 help you identify the most valuable supplies for immediate evacuation. But as you examine crate markings, trying to prioritize ammunition types that will be most useful for ongoing resistance operations, you hear something that changes your risk assessment entirely. Voices upstairs, multiple voices, German voices discussing something with the urgency that indicates tactical rather than routine conversation. And then you hear a word that makes your blood freeze: Aufstand. Uprising. They know. Not just about your small infiltration operation, but about the entire Warsaw Uprising. The voices are discussing troop movements, reinforcement schedules, something about final solutions, and clearing operations that suggests German response goes far beyond what Polish intelligence anticipated. Uprising. They know. Not just about your small operation, but about the entire Warsaw Uprising. The voices are discussing troop movements, reinforcement schedules, something about final solutions, and clearing operations. You realize with growing horror that your intelligence was catastrophically wrong. The Germans weren't caught by surprise by the uprising. They were ready, not just tactically but strategically, with prepared responses that suggest advanced knowledge of Polish resistance plans. The optimistic assessments from Polish High Command, predictions about German troop strength, expectations about Soviet support, assumptions about civilian cooperation, were based on fundamentally flawed intelligence about German preparedness. Listening to the conversation above, you begin to understand the scope of what Polish resistance has walked into. German forces in Warsaw aren't limited to the 16,000 troops that intelligence estimated. From what you're hearing, they have access to much larger numbers, better equipment, and detailed knowledge of Polish positions that could only come from extensive surveillance or infiltration of resistance networks. More disturbing are the references to clearing operations and discussions about timeline acceleration. The language isn't military, it's administrative, the kind of bureaucratic terminology that preceded systematic elimination operations in other occupied territories. The Warsaw Uprising isn't just walking into a military trap, it's providing German forces with justification for implementing plans that were already prepared for population elimination. But this is the moment where you discover something about leadership that no training can teach. Sometimes the most important thing a commander can do is survive long enough to warn others. The intelligence you're gathering has strategic value that exceeds any tactical advantage you might gain from capturing ammunition supplies. Polish Resistance Command needs to understand that German response capabilities are far greater than anticipated, that the uprising is facing systematic rather than improvised opposition, and that continuing current operations will result in catastrophic casualties among both resistance fighters and civilian populations. But first you need to get this information out of this building alive, which requires surviving the next few minutes without alerting the German soldiers whose conversation is. Providing intelligence that could reshape Polish strategy. The voices upstairs have shifted from tactical discussion to what sounds like departure preparation. Someone mentions patrol schedules. Someone else talks about securing the depot before returning to headquarters. They're coming downstairs, probably within minutes, to conduct final security checks before leaving. Your window of opportunity is closing, but you now possess intelligence that's more valuable than any ammunition supplies you could capture. You need to get this information back to Resistance headquarters, but first you need to get out of this building alive. The voices upstairs have shifted from casual conversation to what sounds like tactical planning. Someone mentions patrol schedules. Someone else talks about securing the depot. They're coming downstairs. You signal your men toward the windows, but a quick glance reveals German positions in the courtyard. You're surrounded in a building that's about to be thoroughly searched by soldiers who shoot resistance fighters on sight. Stefan appears beside you, his young face tight with controlled fear. Commander, what are your orders? It's a simple question that contains multitudes. Your orders will determine whether 7 men live or die in the next few minutes. Whether intelligence about German strength reaches Polish command. Whether the small part of Warsaw your battalion was supposed to control remains in Polish or German hands. You look at the crates of German ammunition surrounding you and realize there's a third option nobody considered. Instead of capturing the depot, you could destroy it. One well-placed explosive charge would eliminate the ammunition, create chaos in German logistics, and provide cover for your escape. It would also kill everyone in the building, including any civilians in adjacent structures. It would eliminate supplies your own forces desperately need. And it would announce your position to everyone. The decision you make in the next 30 seconds will haunt you for the rest of your life. The footsteps are getting closer, descending stairs you can't see but can hear clearly. Multiple pairs of boots, moving with military precision. You count at least 4 men, possibly more. Your 7 fighters could take them in a straight fight, but gunfire would alert the entire neighborhood to your presence. You motion Stefan closer and whisper instructions that feel like sending men to their deaths. 3 men will create a distraction at the front of the building while the other 4 escape through the back window. You'll stay behind to plant explosives on the ammunition stores, then attempt to follow. It's a plan that requires someone to sacrifice themselves for the others. Stefan nods understanding, but his eyes ask a question you can't answer. Why are you always the one staying behind? The truth is complicated. As a woman in command, you've learned that authority is fragile, conditional, and constantly questioned. Leading from the rear isn't an option. It confirms every doubt about female leadership. But there's something else, something you've never admitted to anyone. Part of you believes you deserve whatever happens next. 4 months, you've been sending men into situations you wouldn't survive yourself. Every order you give puts someone else's life at risk while you coordinate from relative safety. It's the mathematics of command, but it feels like cowardice dressed up as strategy. What happens next will force you to confront the difference between necessary sacrifice and suicidal guilt. Your men begin moving toward their positions when you hear something that stops everyone cold, a woman's voice upstairs, speaking German. She's talking to the soldiers, but her accent is wrong. It's Polish, disguised but unmistakable to ears trained by 5 years of occupation. Someone else is playing the same game you are. Another resistance fighter has infiltrated this position, probably with similar objectives. But her presence complicates everything. If shooting starts, will she help or betray your position? If you detonate the ammunition, will you be killing an ally along with the enemies? The ethical mathematics of warfare become impossible when you can't identify friends from enemies without revealing yourself. You make a decision that goes against every tactical manual. You're going to try to make contact. You leave your men in position and move toward the stairs, climbing carefully to avoid creaking boards. Through a gap in the stairway, you can see into the room above. 3 German soldiers examining documents while a young woman in civilian clothes translates from Polish to German. She's collaborating, or appearing to, but as you watch, you notice her hands. She's using subtle gestures that match resistance communication signals. She's not just disguised as a collaborator, she's gathering intelligence while providing deliberately wrong translations. You're witnessing a performance that requires incredible nerve and perfect language skills. The woman glances toward the stairs, and for a split second, your eyes meet. She shows no recognition, no surprise, but her next translation contains a phrase that makes the German soldiers relax. The building has been cleared. All resistance activity is concentrated 3 blocks north. Additional security here is unnecessary. She's providing you with an exit strategy. But trusting her could be the mistake that gets everyone killed. Intelligence operations depend on assumptions that can't be verified. Is she really resistance, or is this an elaborate trap? Are the Germans really relaxing their guard, or are they positioning for an ambush? You have perhaps 90 seconds to decide whether to follow her lead or stick to your original escape plan. Stefan appears beside you on the stairs, having moved with the silence of someone whose life depends on not being heard. He's seen the situation above and understands the dilemma. 7 men's lives hang on whether you trust a stranger who might be friend, enemy, or something more complicated. You make your choice. Moving back to your men, you signal for a complete change of plan. Instead of the explosive distraction, you're going to wait 15 minutes, then move as quietly as possible toward the back exit while the woman upstairs continues her performance. It's a plan that depends entirely on her maintaining her cover and the Germans believing her translations. 15 minutes feels like 15 hours when you're hiding in a basement surrounded by enemy ammunition. Every sound from upstairs gets analyzed: footsteps, voices, chair legs scraping across wooden floors. You listen to the woman continue her fake collaboration, providing information that sends German attention anywhere except toward your position. Finally, the voices move away from directly above your location. The woman has convinced them to inspect other parts of the building first, giving you a window, maybe 5 minutes, to get 7 men out of a basement and across occupied territory. You move in single file toward the window you identified earlier. One by one, your men slip through and take positions in the alley behind the building. But as you're preparing to follow, you hear something that changes everything. The woman upstairs has started speaking Polish, not disguised Polish. Not whispered Polish, but clear, intentional Polish in a voice loud enough to be heard throughout the building. She's giving a warning, something about German patrols moving through the area, but her message is really for you. She's telling you to move now, while she still has the Germans distracted. This is the moment where you learn that courage comes in forms military manuals never describe. The woman upstairs is sacrificing her cover to ensure your escape. She's choosing to remain in immediate danger so 7 strangers can live. It's the kind of decision that makes heroes in history books and corpses in real life. You climb through the window and help your men regroup in the alley. Behind you, the building erupts in German voices, surprise, anger, someone barking orders. They've discovered that their translator was feeding them false information, but by now you're already moving through back streets toward your rendezvous point, but the sound that follows you as you retreat isn't gunfire or explosions. It's worse, a woman screaming in German, then Polish, then silence. The resistance fighter who saved your mission has been captured, and you know what that means. In Nazi-occupied Poland, captured resistance members aren't executed cleanly. They're interrogated with techniques designed to extract information about network structures, safe houses, and future operations. The process can last days or weeks, depending on how much the prisoner knows and how long they can resist. The woman who saved you knows you exist. She knows your escape route. Under torture, she might reveal information that will get your entire battalion killed. This is where you discover that successful military operations often depend on people you can never thank and will never see again. Your return journey takes 3 hours through sewers, bombed buildings, and streets that look like war zones from a nightmare. Warsaw has transformed while you were underground. Buildings that stood this morning are now rubble. Streets that were clear are now blocked by overturned cars and construction barriers hastily arranged as barricades. The city is turning itself into a fortress, but as you navigate through the chaos, you notice something that makes your intelligence about German preparedness even more disturbing. The destruction is too systematic, too efficient. Building collapses look like controlled demolitions. Street barricades seem positioned to channel civilians into specific areas. This isn't random warfare, it's urban planning with explosives. The Germans aren't just fighting the uprising. They're reshaping the city's geography to make resistance impossible. Every building that could provide cover is being eliminated. Every street that could serve as an escape route is being blocked. Warsaw is being systematically converted into a killing ground where resistance fighters will have nowhere to hide. You reach your rendezvous point, the basement of a bombed church, and find it empty except for a radio operator who looks like he hasn't slept in days. The news he provides is worse than you expected. Of the 12 battalions that began operations this morning, 3 have been completely eliminated. 4 more are trapped in positions they can't defend. German reinforcements are arriving faster than Polish intelligence predicted, but the most disturbing information comes from intercepted German communications. They're planning something called systematic clearing operations for specific districts. Not military operations, clearing operations. The kind of language used for emptying buildings before demolition. You realize that the Warsaw Uprising isn't just failing, it's providing the Germans with an excuse for something much worse. Your radio operator hands you a message from Polish High Command, and the disconnect between official optimism and ground reality is staggering. The message congratulates battalions on successful initial operations and predicts that Soviet forces will cross the Vistula within days. It orders continued offensive actions against strategic targets, but you've spent the day underground in German ammunition dumps, listening to their tactical discussions, watching their systematic destruction of potential resistance strongholds. The Soviets aren't coming to liberate Warsaw. They're waiting on the east side of the Vistula, letting Germans and Poles exhaust themselves in urban warfare that will make Soviet occupation easier. The political mathematics are brutally simple. A successful Warsaw Uprising would create a liberated Polish capital controlled by the non-communist resistance. Stalin can't allow that. Better to let the uprising fail then present Soviet forces as liberators of a destroyed city that needs communist reconstruction. You're fighting a war that your allies want you to lose. The intelligence you gathered today proves that continuing the uprising will result in the destruction of Warsaw and the massacre of hundreds of thousands of civilians. But stopping the uprising means surrendering to Nazi occupation and abandoning 5 years of resistance work. There is no good choice, and the decision isn't yours to make anyway. You're a battalion commander with 23 men, probably fewer now, and orders to continue offensive operations against targets that are better defended than intelligence suggests. This is where military leadership becomes a form of moral injury that never heals. Stefan arrives at the rendezvous with 15 men, 8 fewer than you started with this morning. His report is delivered in the flat, emotionless tone that soldiers use when describing the unspeakable. 2 men killed by snipers while crossing a street, 3 wounded by grenade fragments, 3 more cut off from the group during German counterattacks. Their names were Tomasz, Henryk, Zbigniew, Marek. January. Tomasz was 19 and studied engineering before the war. Henryk had a daughter who drew him pictures of airplanes. Zbigniew could play guitar well enough to make people forget they were hungry. They died trying to capture ammunition that would have kept other resistance fighters alive for perhaps another week. The mathematics of warfare reduce human lives to tactical calculations, but grief doesn't follow mathematical rules. You feel responsible for every death under your command, while simultaneously knowing that responsibility is a luxury you can't afford. The men who survived need orders for tomorrow, not emotional processing of today's losses, but the orders you're supposed to give make no sense given what you've learned. High Command wants your battalion to continue offensive operations, targeting German positions that are more heavily fortified than intelligence indicates. They want you to hold territory in a city that's being systematically destroyed. They want you to prepare for Soviet support that isn't coming. You look at the 15 exhausted men waiting for leadership, and realize that your most important decision isn't tactical, it's ethical. Do you follow orders that will get these men killed for objectives that are already impossible? Or do you make unauthorized decisions based on intelligence that contradicts official assessments? What you decide will determine not just military outcomes, but whether you can live with yourself after the war. The radio crackles with updates from other battalions, and the news creates a pattern of systematic destruction that confirms your worst fears. German forces aren't just responding to uprising operations. They're implementing a comprehensive plan to eliminate Warsaw as a functioning city. Battalion commanders report that German engineers are placing explosives in historical buildings that have no military significance. Residential blocks with no resistance presence are being evacuated then demolished. Infrastructure that both sides need, hospitals, water treatment facilities, power stations, is being destroyed rather than captured. This isn't military strategy. It's a combination of revenge and urban planning designed to ensure that Warsaw can never again serve as a center of Polish independence. The uprising provided the excuse, but the destruction was always the goal. Your radio operator hands you another message, this one marked Priority Command Communication. It orders your battalion to assist in the defense of the Old Town district, where resistance forces are concentrated in medieval buildings that offer psychological significance but minimal military value. Defending the Old Town means moving your men into confined spaces surrounded by superior German forces. It means fighting building-to-building battles in structures that can't withstand artillery bombardment. It means following orders that are tactically insane but politically necessary. If you follow orders, most of your men will die within days. If you refuse orders, you'll be court-martialed by a resistance organization that can't afford to tolerate unauthorized decision-making. Stefan approaches with a question that puts the entire dilemma in perspective. Commander, the men want to know, are we fighting to win, or fighting to die with honor? It's the kind of question that separates real leadership from theoretical leadership. Your answer will determine not just immediate tactics, but how 15 men face what might be their final days. This is the moment where you discover that the hardest part of command isn't making life or death decisions. It's explaining those decisions to people who trust you enough to follow them into hell. You look at the faces surrounding you in this bombed church basement, illuminated by flickering candles and the dim glow of radio equipment. These men have followed you through sewers and ammunition depots, across occupied territory and through firefights that should have killed them all. They're not asking for reassurance or optimism. They're asking for truth. We're fighting because the alternative is worse, you say finally. The Germans are going to destroy Warsaw whether we resist or not. The only question is whether we make them pay a price for it, and whether we save some people in the process. It's not an inspiring speech, but it's honest. Sometimes leadership means admitting that all available options are terrible, and the best you can do is choose the least catastrophic path forward. Stefan nods, understanding the implications. The other men exchange glances that communicate more than words. They're not motivated by glory or victory anymore. They're motivated by the knowledge that their deaths might prevent someone else's death, that their resistance might save civilians who would otherwise be slaughtered in the systematic clearing operations you've witnessed. But your radio operator interrupts with information that changes everything. Intercepted German communications indicate that Nazi forces are planning to begin final pacification operations in 3 days. Not selective clearing operations, final pacification. The kind of language that preceded the Warsaw Ghetto liquidation. You have 72 hours to get as many people as possible out of Warsaw before the Germans implement whatever final solution they've planned for the city. This is where your mission transforms from military operation to desperate evacuation. Military objectives become irrelevant when you're facing systematic extermination. Capturing ammunition depots, holding strategic positions, and maintaining communication with high command matter less than moving civilians out of areas targeted for pacification. But organizing civilian evacuations requires resources your battalion doesn't have, knowledge of safe routes that may not exist, and cooperation from Polish forces that are focused on military rather than humanitarian objectives. You'll have to convince resistance commanders to divert fighters from combat operations to evacuation assistance. More importantly, you'll have to convince civilians to abandon their homes, businesses, and possessions based on intelligence that officially doesn't exist. Many will refuse to believe that the Germans are planning citywide massacre operations. Others will refuse to leave simply because Warsaw is all they've ever known. Stefan approaches with a map of the city marked with civilian population centers, potential evacuation routes, and German positions that would have to be neutralized to create safe corridors. The scope of the operation is staggering, moving thousands of people across territory controlled by an enemy that has spent 5 years perfecting techniques for mass murder. How many do you think we can save? He asks. It's a question you can't answer with numbers, because the variables are too complex and the time is too limited. But you can answer with something more important than mathematics: as many as possible. We save as many as possible. That becomes your new mission objective: save as many as possible. The transition from military resistance to humanitarian evacuation requires a complete reorganization of priorities, tactics, and personnel. Your men need to become evacuation coordinators, route planners, and civilian protection specialists rather than combat fighters. But the skills that kept you alive as resistance fighters, navigation through dangerous territory, deception of enemy forces, operation under extreme stress, translate directly to evacuation operations. The main difference is that failure now means civilian deaths rather than military casualties. Your first step is establishing contact with other battalion commanders to coordinate evacuation efforts. The radio network that's been used for military communications becomes a humanitarian logistics system. Information about German patrol schedules, safe crossing points, and available transportation gets shared across units that are supposed to be competing for resources. But you discover something that complicates evacuation planning. Not all resistance commanders agree with your intelligence assessment. Some insist that reports of systematic clearing operations are German psychological warfare designed to demoralize Polish forces. Others believe that abandoning military objectives will guarantee German victory. The debate comes down to a fundamental question about resistance strategy. Are you fighting to preserve Polish lives, or fighting to prevent German victory? The two objectives aren't always compatible, and time is too limited for extended discussion. You make an unauthorized decision that will either save thousands of lives or get you executed for disobeying orders. Without approval from high command, you begin contacting civilian organizations, church groups, and neighborhood leaders to organize informal evacuation networks. Your message is simple and direct: In 72 hours, specific districts of Warsaw will become killing zones. People need to move now. While movement is still possible, the response reveals something profound about human nature under extreme stress. Some people immediately begin packing and organizing departures, others refuse to believe the warning, and many simply become paralyzed by the scope of the decision they're being asked to make. An elderly woman approaches you outside the church, speaking in whispers that carry more authority than shouting. My family has lived in Warsaw for 6 generations. My husband is buried in Pulaski Cemetery. My children were born in the house my grandmother built. Where exactly are we supposed to go? It's the question that haunts every evacuation operation. Even if you can move people away from immediate danger, where can they go that will be safe? German occupation extends across most of Poland. Soviet forces control the eastern territories. Neutral countries are closed to refugees. You don't have an answer that addresses the scope of her question, so you focus on the immediate. Anywhere is safer than here after Wednesday. Find relatives in smaller towns, villages, anywhere the Germans haven't planned clearing operations. But as you speak, you realize you're asking people to abandon everything they've built over generations based on intelligence that might be wrong, plans that might be changed, and promises you can't guarantee. This is where leadership becomes a burden that extends far beyond military command. Stefan reports that 3 other battalion commanders have agreed to assist with evacuation operations, but 2 have refused and 1 has reported your activities to high command as unauthorized deviation from military objectives. Within hours, you receive a direct order to cease evacuation activities and report to resistance headquarters for clarification of mission parameters. It's military language for you're in trouble for making decisions above your authorization level. The choice is immediate and stark: follow orders and abandon civilian evacuation efforts, or continue unauthorized operations and face court-martial by your own resistance organization. But as you're considering options, your radio operator receives a transmission that removes the choice from your hands. German forces have accelerated their timeline. Final pacification operations will begin tomorrow night, not in 3 days. You have less than 36 hours to move as many people as possible out of areas targeted for systematic elimination. Military protocol becomes irrelevant when you're racing against genocide. The next 36 hours will determine whether your battalion saves lives or becomes another casualty of wars that consume everyone who participates. Your men understand what abandoning military protocol means. They're choosing civilian rescue over military discipline, humanitarian mission over resistance objectives. It's the kind of decision that gets celebrated in history books or condemned as cowardice, depending on outcomes and perspective. But the men who followed you through sewers and ammunition depots understand something about the nature of this particular war. Winning and losing have become less important than maintaining humanity in situations designed to destroy it. Stefan organizes evacuation teams while you coordinate with civilian leaders about transportation, routes, and temporary shelter. Locations. The operation requires precision timing, accurate intelligence, and cooperation from people who have spent 5 years learning not to trust anyone, but it also requires something military training never teaches: the ability to convince people to make life-changing decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. Every conversation with civilian families becomes a form of psychological warfare against denial, inertia, and despair. A woman with 3 children asks you, if we leave everything behind and you're wrong about German plans, how do we rebuild our lives? If you're right about German plans and we stay, her family will probably be dead within days. But if you're wrong, they'll be refugees with no home to return to. You can't guarantee outcomes either way, so you focus on probabilities. Based on what I've seen, staying is almost certainly fatal. Leaving is definitely difficult, but difficulty is better than death. It's the kind of conversation that shapes how you understand moral responsibility for the rest of your life. As dawn breaks on what may be the final day of the Warsaw Uprising, your makeshift evacuation network has managed to move approximately 2,000 civilians out of the areas targeted for clearing operations. It's a significant number, but it represents less than 10% of the people still in danger zones. The mathematics are impossible. Even if every resistance fighter abandoned military objectives to focus on evacuation, there isn't enough time or transportation to move everyone who needs to be moved. You're forced to make decisions about which families get priority assistance, which neighborhoods get evacuation resources, which people get saved and which get abandoned to German systematic elimination. These decisions feel like playing God, but they're really just the logical extension of military triage applied to civilian populations. Save who you can, move as quickly as possible, don't let perfect become the enemy of good enough. But around noon, your radio operator receives intelligence that changes everything one final time. Soviet forces are crossing the Vistula. Not in 3 days or 3 weeks, but now. Russian artillery can be heard from the eastern districts of Warsaw. The timing isn't coincidental. Stalin has waited until German and Polish forces have exhausted themselves in urban warfare, then moved to occupy a city too damaged to resist Soviet control. It's brilliant strategy from a geopolitical perspective, and catastrophic for everyone currently trapped in Warsaw. This is where you discover that survival in war often depends more on luck than skill, more on timing than courage. Soviet artillery doesn't distinguish between German positions and civilian shelters. Russian forces don't have accurate intelligence about Polish evacuation routes. The arrival of Soviet troops means that Warsaw is about to become a three-way battlefield where previous agreements, safe passages, and evacuation plans become meaningless. Your battalion is trapped in a city that's simultaneously under German elimination operations, Soviet liberation operations, and Polish resistance operations. Every move you make could put you in conflict with forces that consider you either enemy combatants or acceptable casualties, but Stefan approaches with information that offers one final opportunity. Intercepted German communications indicate that Nazi forces are beginning emergency evacuation of their own personnel from Warsaw. They're pulling back to defensive positions outside the city, leaving behind booby traps and demolition charges designed to deny infrastructure to Soviet occupiers. If German forces are retreating, evacuation routes that were impossible this morning might be accessible now. The window is probably measured in hours rather than days, but it exists. You face a final command decision that will determine whether your battalion tries to escape Warsaw or stays to face whatever comes next under Soviet occupation. Your men have followed you this far, but this choice affects more than military operations. It affects their entire futures under whatever government controls Poland after the war. This decision will determine not just whether you survive, but what kind of person you become based on how you handle power when everything is falling apart. Stefan presents the tactical situation with military precision. 3 possible evacuation routes, each with different risk profiles and probable outcomes. Route 1 takes your battalion through German abandoned positions toward areas that might become German-Soviet battlefields. Route 2 goes east toward advancing Soviet forces who might treat Polish resistance fighters as allies or threats. Route 3 stays in Warsaw during what will probably be the most chaotic period of the entire war, but you realize that the men surrounding you in this bombed church basement are asking a different question than tactical analysis can answer. They want to know whether the woman who has led them through impossible situations believes there's hope for something better on the other side of whatever comes next. You look at 15 faces that have aged years in the past weeks, and realize that your answer matters less than the fact that they're still asking the question. After everything they've witnessed, they still believe that choices matter, that leadership means something, and that tomorrow might be different from today. We've saved over 2,000 people, you say. We've gathered intelligence that will help other resistance operations. We've proven that small groups can make differences in situations where everything seems hopeless. Whatever happens next, we've already accomplished something important. It's not a tactical assessment, but it's true. And in wars where victory and defeat become meaningless categories, truth becomes more valuable than strategy. The ending of this story isn't determined by military outcomes, but by the recognition that survival itself is a form of resistance. As night falls on Warsaw, your battalion prepares for whatever comes next. Some men will try evacuation routes toward uncertain safety. Others will remain in the city they fought to defend. Most will make decisions based on family obligations, personal attachments, or intuitions that can't be reduced to tactical analysis. You've learned something about command that military manuals don't teach. The most important thing a leader can do is help people maintain their humanity in situations designed to destroy it. Whether that means fighting impossible battles, organizing hopeless evacuations, or simply treating individual lives as if they matter when everything around you suggests they don't, the Warsaw Uprising will officially end in defeat. The city will be systematically destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians will die in the next few months. But in this moment, in this basement, 15 people have maintained their ability to make moral choices under conditions where moral choice seems impossible. That's not victory in any traditional sense, but it's something that survives when military victories fade from memory. Stefan extinguishes the radio and packs the equipment that connected your battalion to the larger resistance organization. Tomorrow, you'll be individuals making personal decisions about survival rather than soldiers following military objectives. But tonight, you're still together, still choosing to care about outcomes that extend beyond your own immediate safety. And that's why you wouldn't last a day as Wanda Gertz in the Warsaw Uprising, not because the tactical challenges are impossible, but because the moral challenges require a kind of strength that can't be taught or practiced. The choices she made, and that her fighters made, represent human responses to inhuman situations. They faced decisions where every option involved terrible consequences, where good intentions led to tragic outcomes, where survival required compromising values that had previously seemed non-negotiable, but they continued making choices, continued taking responsibility, continued believing that individual actions mattered even when the larger historical forces seemed overwhelming. They maintained their humanity not by avoiding impossible decisions, but by continuing to make those decisions with care and intention. As you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable and safe in a world that Wanda Gertz could barely have imagined, remember that the choices she faced weren't unique to her time or place. The same moral challenges, how to maintain ethics under pressure, how to balance individual safety against collective responsibility, how to make decisions when all options seem wrong, still exist today, in different forms but with similar weight. The Warsaw Uprising ended in military defeat but moral complexity that continues to resonate decades later. The people who participated learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act according to your values when fear is overwhelming. They learned that leadership isn't about having all the answers, but about helping others find their own answers in impossible situations, and they learned that survival itself, when it requires maintaining your humanity in inhuman conditions, becomes a form of victory that transcends military outcomes. Sweet dreams. And remember, the choices that define us aren't the easy ones made in comfortable circumstances, but the impossible ones made when everything we care about is at stake. Wanda Gertz understood that, and somehow, incredibly, managed to keep choosing humanity even when humanity seemed impossible.